The canoe had a crack along the left side that my father patched with pine tar every spring. I know because I was the one who held the flashlight while he worked, kneeling on the dock in the dark, muttering about how the lake got colder every year. That canoe is still hanging in the boathouse at the cabin in Muskoka, or it was until recently. I'm 64 years old. I spent 41 years as a civil engineer, raised one son mostly on my own after my wife Eleanor passed, and I have never in my life done anything that felt as good as what I did 8 months ago. I'm not proud of needing to do it, but I'm not ashamed either. Let me start from the beginning, because the ending only makes sense if you understand what that cabin meant. My grandfather, Edmund, built the cabin on Lake Rosso in 1958. He was a carpenter by trade and a stubborn man by nature, and he spent 3 summers cutting timber, pouring concrete, hauling everything up a gravel road that barely qualified as a road. My grandmother, Frances, planted a garden along the south wall. I have a photograph of her kneeling in the dirt, laughing at something my grandfather said. She's wearing a yellow dress. The light is exactly the kind of light you only get on a lake in August. I've kept that photograph on the mantelpiece above the fireplace for as long as I can remember. My parents spent every summer there. I spent every summer there. When Eleanor and I got married, we spent our first anniversary there, paddling across the lake at sunrise with a thermos of terrible coffee between us. When our son Kevin was born, we brought him up to the cabin when he was 6 weeks old and sat on the dock watching him discover his own hands. Eleanor died of cancer 11 years ago. Kevin was 22. He held himself together at the funeral and fell apart quietly for months afterward, and I let him because grief doesn't follow a schedule. I kept the cabin. Of course I kept it. It wasn't even a question. Kevin met Danielle at a work conference in Ottawa when he was 26. She was from Toronto, sharp, funny when she wanted to be, and she had a quality I can only describe as certainty. She always seemed absolutely sure she was the most reasonable person in any room. I liked her at first. I thought she was good for Kevin, who has always been a little too careful, a little too reluctant to take up space. They got engaged after 2 years. I gave them my blessing genuinely. I was happy for him. The first summer they came up to Lake Rosso together, Danielle mentioned that the cabin felt dated. I nodded and said Eleanor had decorated it in the 80s, and we'd never really changed much. Danielle looked around in a way that I now understand was assessment, not admiration. At the time, I thought nothing of it. They got married in September. Beautiful wedding, out in Prince Edward County. I danced badly and cried appropriately. Kevin looked at Danielle like she hung the moon. I told myself I was happy, and I was, mostly. The following spring, Kevin called me. He and Danielle were paying nearly $3,000 a month for their apartment in Toronto, and with Danielle pregnant, they were thinking about their options. He asked, carefully and with a lot of preamble, whether they might be able to stay at the cabin while they figured things out. I said yes. I said yes because he was my son, and she was pregnant and the cabin was sitting empty 10 months out of the year. And what was I going to do, say no? I told them they could stay through the summer, see how things went. They moved in that May. My granddaughter Abby was born in July. I drove up from Barrie, where I'd moved into a smaller place after Eleanor died, and I held that baby on the dock in the evening light, and I thought, this is what the cabin is for, this exact moment, 4 generations. I went back to Barrie. They stayed. Summer turned to fall. Fall turned to winter. Kevin called in October to say they'd decided to stay through the winter because the Toronto market was brutal, and they were trying to save for a down payment. I said fine. I said it was fine. I want to be honest with you about something. I was a little lonely. I won't dress it up. I missed having people at the cabin, and I told myself that Kevin and Danielle and Abby being there was a kind of continuity, a kind of life in the walls of a place that had been quiet for too long. I convinced myself that this arrangement was working for everyone. The first sign that it wasn't working the way I imagined was small. I drove up for Thanksgiving, Canadian Thanksgiving, so mid-October, and Danielle had moved the furniture around in the main room. The armchairs were gone from in front of the fireplace, replaced by a sectional sofa she'd brought from their Toronto storage unit. The braided rug my grandmother made was rolled up in the corner. I didn't say anything. People make spaces their own. I understood that. But Eleanor's photograph was gone from the mantelpiece. I asked Kevin about it, quietly, in the kitchen while Danielle was putting Abby down. He looked uncomfortable and said Danielle had rearranged some things and he wasn't sure where it had gone. I found it in a cardboard box in the storage room, face down, between a broken lamp and a bag of old curtains. I took it home with me that weekend. I put it on my mantelpiece in Barrie, and I thought about it for a long time. The second year, the small signs became larger ones. Danielle started referring to the cabin as our place, not in a casual way, in a deliberate way, the way you say something when you want it to become true by repetition. She posted photographs on Instagram with captions like "Home Sweet Home on the Lake" and Abby's first real Canadian summer. Friends of Kevin's would ask me how my son's cottage was doing. I corrected them gently. They looked confused. Kevin called less. When we did talk, he seemed tired in a way that had nothing to do with the baby. I asked once if everything was okay, and he said yes, just busy, just adjusting. I believed him because I wanted to. That fall, Danielle asked me through Kevin. She rarely spoke to me directly about anything substantive, whether I'd considered putting the cabin in both their names. For stability, she said. For Abby's future. Kevin delivered this message with the expression of a man who had already lost the argument on his end and was now just responsible for the announcement. I said no. I said it was kind of them to think about long-term planning, but the cabin was not something I was prepared to transfer to anyone at this time. Kevin relayed my answer. There was a week of reduced communication afterward. Then things went back to a new normal that felt slightly colder than before. I kept telling myself it was fine. I kept driving up for Christmas and Easter and a few summer weekends, and each time the cabin felt slightly less like mine. New things had appeared: a smart TV, a coffee machine that cost more than my first car, outdoor furniture that was very sleek and very uncomfortable. The garden Francis planted along the south wall had been replaced with decorative stones. I stood looking at those stones for a long time the first time I noticed them. I didn't say anything about the garden. I should have said something about the garden. The visit that changed everything happened on a Friday in March, 2.5 years after Kevin and Danielle moved in. I drove up unannounced. I know, and I take responsibility for not calling ahead, but it was my cabin, and I'd been making the drive without calling ahead for 40 years. I let myself in with my key. The cabin was quiet. Kevin was at work in Huntsville, where he'd taken a remote position that had eventually become a commute. Danielle was home with Abby. She came out of the kitchen when she heard the door, and her face did something complicated, not surprised, annoyed. She recovered quickly and said hello and asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes, thank you. Abby came running from somewhere and I swung her up and she laughed. And that part was good, that part was still good. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee. Danielle sat across from me. There was a quality to the silence that I didn't like. After a few minutes, she said, in a very calm and conversational tone, that she'd been thinking it would be nice to have the cabin properly renovated, open up the kitchen, put in new windows, convert the boathouse into a guest suite. I said the cabin didn't need renovating. She said the cabin was 65 years old and needed significant updating to function as a proper family home. I said it had functioned as a proper family home for 65 years and I wasn't interested in a renovation. She said, still calm, still conversational, that Kevin and Abby deserved a home that suited them, and that at some point I needed to think seriously about what I was holding on to and why. I looked at her across the table. I put my coffee mug down very carefully. I said, this cabin belonged to my grandfather. It belonged to my father. It belonged to my wife and me. It will belong to Kevin when I decide what to do with it. It does not belong to you. That's when she stopped being calm. She stood up. She said I had no idea how much they had sacrificed to maintain this place, how much work she had put into making it livable. She said Kevin had given up opportunities in Toronto to accommodate my attachment to a building. She said that Eleanor was gone, she said, Eleanor's name like it was a problem, and that I needed to stop treating a dead woman's memory like it was more important than my son's actual living family. I stood up too. She walked to the mantelpiece. I'd brought the photograph back. I'd put it back up on my last visit. In what I see now was an act of quiet stubbornness, and she picked up the photograph of Eleanor and she tore it in half. She tore it in half and set both pieces down on the mantelpiece and looked at me. I didn't yell. I have yelled perhaps 6 times in my adult life, and this was not one of them. I picked up both halves of the photograph. I put them in my jacket pocket. I kissed Abby on the top of her head. I walked out to my truck. I sat in the truck for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock. Then I drove back to Barrie. I called Kevin that night. I told him what had happened, calmly and in order. There was a long silence on his end. Then he said he was sorry. He would talk to her. He was sure she hadn't meant it the way it came out. I asked him if he thought tearing a photograph of his mother in half was something that could be explained away by tone. He went quiet again. He said he needed some time. I gave him 2 weeks. He called back and said Danielle was under a lot of stress, that the situation had been hard on her too, that he hoped we could move forward. He did not say she was wrong. He did not say she would apologize. He said he hoped we could move forward. I said I hoped so too. I hung up and called my lawyer, a woman named Sandra, who has handled my affairs for 15 years. And I told her I wanted to sell the cabin. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right, tell me where we are." I told her where we were. The cabin was in my name alone. Eleanor and I had updated our estate documents after her diagnosis, and the cabin had always been mine specifically. There was no co-ownership, no registered interest of any kind in Kevin or Danielle's name. Kevin and Danielle were occupying it without a formal lease agreement, which Sandra told me meant they were technically month-to-month occupants with no legal claim to the property. She asked if I'd considered whether to simply ask them to leave rather than sell. I had considered it. I'd thought about it for 2 weeks. The honest answer was that I didn't trust what would happen next. Danielle had already floated the idea of transferring the property to their names. I didn't know what advice she'd received, what she thought her options were, whether she might challenge anything. The safest and cleanest thing, the thing that would leave no ambiguity, was to sell the property to someone who had nothing to do with any of us, and to do it quickly and properly. Sandra said she understood. She asked if I was sure. I said I was. She connected me with a real estate agent, a man named Bob who specialized in Muskoka cottage country and who did not waste my time. I drove up to the cabin on a Thursday morning in April, when I knew Kevin would be in Huntsville. I let myself in, walked through every room, took the things that were mine. The photograph both halves, which I'd had restored and framed, a process that cost $240 and was worth every cent, came with me. My grandmother's braided rug, which I found in the storage room again, a set of my father's fishing rods, a wooden box my mother had carved her initials into, 3 boxes total. I left a letter on the kitchen table. I said I had made the decision to sell the property. I said they would receive formal written notice within the week from my lawyer. I said I was sorry for the disruption this would cause, and that I hoped, in time, we could find a way to be family again. I drove away. I did not look back. I know that sounds deliberate. It was. The notice arrived via Sandra's office the following Tuesday. They had 60 days. Kevin called me that night. He was not calm the way I had been calm. He said I couldn't do this, that Abby loved the cabin, that this was their home, that he had built his life here. I let him talk. When he was finished, I said that I had tried for 2.5 years to make this work. I said that his wife had destroyed a photograph of his mother. I said that when I asked him to account for that, he had asked me to move forward. I said I had moved forward, and this was where forward led. He said he had no money. He said they'd been unable to save anything. I thought about the coffee machine, the sectional, the decorative stones where Francis's garden used to be. I didn't say those things. I said I was sorry to hear that, and I hoped they would figure it out. And I said goodbye. Danielle called the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 4 minutes long and covered several themes, including my character, my fitness as a father, my relationship with Eleanor, and the legal advice she was apparently seeking. I forwarded the voicemail to Sandra. Sandra said there was nothing in it that constituted a legal threat and advised me not to respond directly. I didn't. Bob listed the cabin in May. It sold in 3 weeks for $2,100,000. The market in Muskoka, as it turns out, had been very kind to lakefront properties. I stood in Sandra's office and signed the closing documents and felt something that I can only describe as a door closing gently, without drama. Kevin and Danielle moved to a rental in Huntsville. I know this because Kevin texted me, eventually, to let me know they had found a place. His message was short. I wrote back, "I'm glad." Let me know when you want to talk. He didn't respond for 6 weeks. I took the 2 million, and I thought carefully about what to do with it. I set aside a portion for Abby in a trust that she will access when she's 25, not before, and not through her parents. I updated my will. I gave a sum to a conservation organization that works on Muskoka Lake health, because my grandfather would have wanted that, and because it felt right. The rest I've been sitting with. I'm not extravagant by nature. In June, 2 months after the sale, I went to a woodworking class at a community center in Barrie. I had been meaning to do this for years and had never gotten around to it. The class was run by a woman named Harriet, who was 61 years old, had recently retired from 30 years of teaching high school English, and had opinions about dovetail joints that I found unexpectedly interesting. We had coffee after the second class, then dinner after the fourth. I haven't rushed anything. I am 64 years old, and I have learned that the good things in life do not arrive on a schedule. But I will say that sitting across a dinner table from someone who laughs easily and argues honestly and doesn't look at you like you're a problem to be managed, that is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all. Kevin and I spoke properly for the first time in November. He called on a Sunday afternoon, and I could tell from his voice that he had prepared himself for the call, the way you prepare yourself for something hard. He said he was sorry. He didn't qualify it. He said he should have handled things differently and that he knew it and that he was sorry. I said thank you. I told him I loved him. I told him I would always be his father. He asked about the cabin. I told him the people who bought it were a family from Mississauga, 2 parents and 3 children, and that they planned to use it every summer. I said I thought that was a good ending for it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought so too. We see each other monthly now. Abby calls me Grandpa and climbs on me like a piece of furniture, which I find entirely acceptable. Danielle and I have not spoken directly, but Kevin tells me she is doing better, that they are doing better, that the smaller apartment and the smaller life have turned out to suit them. I don't know what to believe about that, and I don't need to know yet. The photograph of Eleanor restored, reframed, the seam down the middle barely visible if you don't know to look sits on my mantelpiece in Barrie. The lake light in it is exactly right. She is laughing at something my father said, and my grandfather is somewhere behind the camera holding a cup of tea. It is August in the photograph. It is always August. I still miss the cabin. I want to be clear about that. I miss the specific sound of rain on that particular roof, and the way the dock shifted underfoot in the mornings, and the crack of the screen door that my father never fixed, because he said it announced visitors, and he liked knowing someone was coming. I miss it the way you miss something that was fully itself, and fully yours. But I do not regret what I did. Not for 1 second. You can love something completely and still let it go. You can love your son completely and still hold a line. Those 2 things coexist in me now, and I'm making peace with both of them, slowly, in the way that 64-year-old men who have lived enough life make peace with things, not with noise, not with performance, just quietly, in the mornings, with decent coffee, and enough light coming through the window to see by. Harriet is teaching me to make a cabinet. My joints are imprecise, and she is not gentle with her feedback, which I respect. My grandfather would have found the whole situation amusing. I think Eleanor would have too. I think she would have liked Harriet very much. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any mystical sense, just the plain, observable truth that what we allow tends to expand, and what we refuse to address tends to harden into something we can no longer ignore. I allowed a lot over those 2.5 years. I allowed the furniture to move, the garden to disappear, the photograph to end up face down in a storage room. I told myself I was being generous. I told myself I was being a good father. But there's a version of generosity that's really just avoidance dressed up in nicer clothes, and I was wearing that version for a long time. When Danielle tore Eleanor's photograph in half and set both pieces on the mantelpiece and looked at me, that was the moment I stopped being able to avoid anything. And I think, if I'm honest, some part of me was almost relieved, because there it finally was. Clear, undeniable, something I didn't have to talk myself into seeing. The hard thing about that kind of clarity is that it asks something of you. It's not enough to just see it. You have to act on it, and acting on it means accepting that the consequences of your action are going to be real and uncomfortable, and will affect people you love. Kevin was angry. Abby didn't understand why she couldn't go back to the lake. Those things were real costs. I don't minimize them. But I've come to believe that protecting yourself, your history, your dignity, the memory of someone you loved, is not selfishness. It took me 64 years to understand that boundary setting is not cruelty. It can be done quietly, legally, without malice, and it can still be an act of profound self-respect. What I did was not revenge in the way people usually mean the word. I didn't want Danielle to suffer. I wanted the cabin to be out of reach of someone who had demonstrated she didn't value what it represented. There's a difference. The cabin had held 4 generations of my family. It had held Eleanor laughing in August light. It was not a bargaining chip. Once I understood that she saw it as exactly that, a bargaining chip, the decision made itself. The tricky thing about intelligence, and I mean practical intelligence, the kind that actually gets you through hard situations, is that it requires you to see things as they are, rather than as you wish they were. I wished Kevin would hold the line. He didn't. I wished Danielle would understand the meaning of what she was living inside. She didn't. Wishing those things for another 18 months wasn't going to change them. Seeing them clearly and acting accordingly that changed things. Kevin and I are rebuilding something. It's slower than I'd like, and some of the original structure is gone and won't come back. But what's there now is more honest. That counts for something. That might count for everything. Harriet told me recently, while correcting my dovetail joints for the 4th time, that the best furniture is the kind built to last rather than built to impress. I laughed. She didn't know she was describing the last 8 months of my life. Maybe she did. The photograph of Eleanor is on my mantelpiece. The seam is barely visible. She is still laughing. I still miss the cabin, and I am still, slowly, building something new. That seems like enough.